At her sister's brunch, my wife handed me coffee and whispered, "It's special just for you." She smiled while they laughed. I didn't drink it. 32 minutes later, her sister collapsed. 911 came. I kept my phone recording the whole time. The golden autumn sunlight streamed through the bay windows of Caroline's dining room, casting warm patterns across the polished oak table. Sunday brunch at my sister-in-law's house had become a monthly ritual, complete with the customary small talk and forced laughter. Everyone seemed at ease except me. Something about this morning sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't explain. I watched the scene unfold like a commercial for family togetherness, picture-perfect, meticulously arranged, and entirely artificial. Caroline bustled about refilling mimosa glasses while her husband told another tired joke about golf. 3 other couples from their social circle nodded and smiled on cue. More bacon. Nathan. Caroline's husband pushed the platter toward me. "I'm good," I replied, keeping my usual economy of words. As creative director at Baxley & Roth, I saved my verbal flourishes for client pitches where they called me their ace in the hole. 8 years building the agency's reputation had taught me the power of silence in a room full of noise. Jessica appeared from the kitchen, her designer dress hugging her frame perfectly, not a strand of hair out of place. My wife of 5 years, the deputy director of project development at the same agency, carried 2 mugs with practiced grace. Anyone watching would see only her radiant smile, the one she reserved for public appearances. "Here you go, honey," she said, placing a steaming mug before me. "I made it special just the way you like it." Her voice dripped sweetness, her eyes meeting mine with practiced affection. I nodded my thanks and lifted the mug. Dark, rich coffee swirled inside, wisps of steam carrying its aroma upward. Something felt off. The scent wasn't quite right. I tilted my head slightly, inhaling again. There it was beneath the familiar coffee notes. Something metallic and foreign, like dried blood mixed with some chemical preservative. Subtle enough that no one else would notice, but unmistakable to me. I didn't flinch. I didn't change my expression, but every instinct in my body screamed a warning. After 8 months of unexplained hospital visits, my survival instincts had sharpened considerably. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every time I had a major presentation or client meeting, I'd fall violently ill, crippling stomach pain, vomiting, blurred vision, always after eating something Jessica had prepared, specially for me. Never enough to kill, just enough to sideline me at crucial moments. 3 weeks ago, I'd started keeping a symptom journal. 2 weeks ago, I'd installed a tiny camera in our kitchen. Last week, I'd set my phone to record automatically with any movement. Today, I was setting a trap of my own. "Sorry, my phone's buzzing," I said, casually pulling out my device. As expected, everyone ignored me, continuing their mindless chatter about property values and private schools. I pretended to check a message, then deliberately knocked my spoon off the table. "Damn," I muttered, bending down to retrieve it. In one fluid motion as I rose, I swapped my untouched coffee with Caroline's cup. Jessica had turned away, just long enough, speaking to someone across the table. When Jessica turned back, her smile remained fixed, but her pupils contracted sharply. Her gaze wasn't on me, or even on Caroline. It was locked onto the coffee mug now sitting in front of her sister. I didn't drink from my new cup. Instead, I wrapped my hand around it, stirring occasionally, as if savoring it. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Caroline's laughter became more brittle. Jessica crossed and uncrossed her legs under the table, her knuckles white around her fork. A silent question tormented me. Had I just condemned an innocent person to death? The thought came and went like a terrible shadow. Caroline kept talking, seemingly unaffected so far. Caroline lifted the mug, my original mug, to her lips for a second time. I heard the gentle tap of ceramic against her mouth. My eyes darted to Jessica, who wasn't looking at either of us but staring intently at the cup itself. Her expression chilled me to the core. The look of a gambler who had placed everything on a single roll of the dice and was waiting for death to show its numbers. I glanced at my watch. 10:16 a.m. Time to start the countdown. The conversation around me continued, mundane and oblivious. Caroline's husband droned on about property taxes, while Jessica maintained her perfect smile, occasionally touching my shoulder with practiced affection. I remained still waiting. At 10:28, 12 minutes after Caroline had taken her second sip, I noticed her rubbing her forehead. Her words came slower, slightly slurred. "I'm just a little dizzy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably didn't sleep enough last night, or maybe the coffee's too strong." Jessica jumped in immediately. "Oh, I forgot you prefer decaf, don't you? I'm so sorry I made it regular strength." She reached for Caroline's mug. "Let me get you something else." I caught the contradiction instantly. Earlier, Jessica had told me she'd made the coffee, special just for me. Now she claimed she'd made it for everyone, just too strong. I filed away the inconsistency, another piece of evidence. By 10:34, the symptoms were progressing rapidly. Caroline switched seats, claiming she needed more air. "My fingers feel numb," she said, flexing her hand repeatedly, "and everything looks blurry at a distance. Maybe it's a flu coming on," I suggested, casually, keeping my voice light. "Or poisoned coffee." I forced a laugh and everyone joined in except Jessica. Her jaw locked for just a split second, a micro-expression of panic that confirmed everything. At 10:38, Caroline was visibly deteriorating. She propped her head up with her palms, struggling to stay upright. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow. Sweat beaded along her hairline. Despite the room's comfortable temperature, I watched Jessica carefully. Her eyes darted repeatedly between the empty coffee mug and her sister, calculating something behind that mask of concern. She was counting down too. I realized, waiting for specific symptoms to appear. I quietly took out my phone, reactivated the recording app, and decided to push further. "You got up early to prepare for brunch today, didn't you?" I asked Jessica, keeping my tone conversational. "Just the usual time," she replied, her voice carrying the slightest tremor. "Nothing special. The coffee tastes different today. Did you try a new method?" I pressed, watching her reaction closely. Jessica's eyes flickered away from mine. "Just trying something new with the bean ratio. Do you like it?" "I haven't decided yet," I answered truthfully. Caroline's voice interrupted, barely audible now. "My heart's racing. I feel so cold." Jessica's composure cracked slightly. She jumped up, rushing to the kitchen. "I'll get some orange juice. Sugar might help." When she returned with the glass, I noticed something telling. Instead of handing it directly to Caroline, Jessica placed it on the table and stepped back, as if afraid to get too close to what she'd created. The moment had come for confrontation. "It's strange," I said, addressing Jessica directly, "that since January, every time I eat something you've prepared specially for me, I end up in the hospital." Jessica's eyes widened. "That's not fair, Nathan." "What's not fair?" I cut in, "is that I haven't taken a single sip of coffee today, but Caroline did, and now she's experiencing exactly what I've been going through for 8 months. Jessica's face paled. "That's just coincidence. Caroline has low blood pressure." "I don't have low blood pressure." Caroline interrupted, her words coming out in gasps. "I'm perfectly healthy. I..." Before she could finish, Caroline's head slumped forward onto the table. Her breathing became labored, her skin taking on a sickly blue-gray tinge. The other guests jumped up, confusion and panic spreading through the room. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "This is an emergency," I told the dispatcher, my voice calm and clear. "I need an ambulance at 1842 Lakeview Drive. I suspect chemical poisoning in coffee. The victim is a 38-year-old female showing symptoms of neurotoxicity: rapid heartbeat, numbness, blurred vision, loss of coordination." Jessica stood frozen, her face drained of color. The other guests hovered uncertainly, looking to me for guidance. Caroline's husband knelt beside her, desperately calling her name. "They'll be here in 5 minutes," I said after hanging up. "Everyone step back and give her air." I walked out to the balcony while the others attended to Caroline. I made another call to Mitchell Devane, my personal attorney. I briefly explained the situation and asked him to meet me at the hospital. He agreed without hesitation, having represented me for years. When I returned to the dining room, I approached Jessica, who stood apart from the chaos, still as a statue. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time that day, her mask was completely gone. "You picked the wrong person to target," I said quietly, so only she could hear, "and the wrong cup to pour poison into." The wail of sirens grew louder outside. EMTs rushed in with equipment and a stretcher. I stepped back watching as they stabilized Caroline and prepared her for transport. I provided the medics with the timeline of symptoms and my suspicions about the coffee. As they carried Caroline out, I looked down at the untouched coffee cup still sitting in front of my place at the table. I didn't need any further confirmation. That innocent-looking mug held all the evidence needed to expose a calculated slow-motion murder attempt. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, their movements urgent but controlled. As they took Caroline's vitals, their expressions grew more concerned. Blood pressure dangerously low. Heart rate, erratic pupils slightly dilated. One medic whispered to another, "Possible neurotoxin." I watched from a slight distance, maintaining my composure while internally cataloging every abnormality I'd experienced over the past 8 months. The nausea before the Henderson pitch, the violent stomach cramps before the board presentation, the blurred vision just hours before meeting our biggest potential client. All following meals or drinks Jessica had specially prepared. "Will you ride with her, sir?" One of the paramedics asked Caroline's husband, who nodded mutely, face ashen. "I'll follow in my car," I replied, grabbing my jacket. As we moved toward the door, I glanced back at Jessica. She stood perfectly still amid the chaos, not offering to accompany her sister, not asking questions about her condition. Her eyes locked with mine, not with remorse or guilt, but with fear. Not fear for Caroline, I realized, but fear for herself. The ambulance tore through Sunday traffic, siren wailing. I followed close behind, mind razor sharp despite the situation. By the time we reached Memorial Hospital, Caroline had been moved to the ICU. A doctor with silver-streaked hair approached us in the waiting area. "I'm Dr. Winters," he said grimly. "We're looking at a grade 2 toxic reaction. We need to identify the substance and begin dialysis immediately." Before anyone could speak, I stepped forward. "Doctor, I believe the victim was deliberately poisoned by a family member, likely with a metallic-based chemical agent." Caroline's husband turned to me in shock, but I continued addressing the doctor. "I have evidence you should hear." I pulled out my phone and played the recording from brunch. Jessica's voice came through clearly. "It's special just for you," followed by our confrontation after Caroline fell ill. By this time, a hospital security officer had approached. He introduced himself as a former detective, and after hearing the recording, called the police. "I'll need a copy of that." He said I sent it immediately, then excused myself. "I need to check something at home." I told Caroline's husband, "Call me if there's any change." The house was silent when I arrived. Jessica hadn't returned. I went straight to my home office and retrieved the mini camera I'd hidden on the bookshelf 2 weeks earlier. I downloaded the footage and fast-forwarded through hours of empty rooms until I found what I needed. There she was, Jessica alone in the kitchen. At 5:43 a.m. that morning, she moved with deliberate precision, brewing coffee, then glancing over her shoulder before removing a small vial from her purse. She carefully measured drops into one specific mug, my usual one, before returning the vial to her bag. Her expression was clinical, detached, as if she were conducting a routine experiment rather than attempting to poison her husband. I printed several clear frames from the video, physical evidence of her actions. Then I retrieved my symptom journal and cross-referenced dates. Days I'd been ill against. Days Jessica had prepared special meals. The correlation was over 90%. I called Mitchell Devane, my attorney for the past decade. "I need you to file criminal charges," I said after explaining the situation. "Attempted murder by poisoning. I have video, audio, and physical evidence. I'll meet you at the police station in 30 minutes. He replied without hesitation. I had one more call to make. Detective Reese from the Major Crimes Unit arrived with a search warrant within the hour. He and his team methodically went through our house while I watched from the living room. "Mr. Hale," an officer called from the kitchen. "We found something." Behind the sink, hidden beneath a stack of dish towels, they discovered a black metal box with a combination lock. The detective used tools to force it open. Inside the box were 8 small glass vials. 3 of them were empty, while the other 5 contained a brownish liquid that looked suspiciously medical. Underneath these vials lay a handwritten notebook. The detective flipped it open, revealing pages of meticulous notes written in Jessica's neat handwriting. Each entry documented dates, dosages, Symptoms and Effectiveness Ratings. A Poisoner's Laboratory Journal. One entry from June 12th showed she'd used 0.4 milligrams to cause stomach pain and vomiting, rating its effectiveness at 70%. Another from July 23rd noted an increased dosage of 0.5 milligrams produced blurred vision and disorientation with 85% effectiveness. The most recent entry from August 17th chillingly recorded that 0.6 milligrams caused temporary paralysis and slurred speech, rated at 90% effectiveness, though she complained the recovery was too quick. The final page held a flyer for an illicit medical chemical supplier with an address in a border town 3 hours away. Detective Reese photographed everything before bagging it as evidence. "She was experimenting," I said quietly, "increasing the dosage gradually, testing how much she could give you without causing death." The detective agreed. "This is methodical, Mr. Hale, premeditated, and she used her own sister as a test subject today." They took the evidence and left officers stationed outside my house. I was told to call immediately if Jessica returned. She did just after 9 p.m. I watched from the upstairs window as her car pulled into the driveway. She paused before entering, smoothing her hair and straightening her clothes, always conscious of appearances even now. The moment she stepped through the door, the officers moved in. She didn't struggle as they read her rights, didn't protest as they placed handcuffs on her wrists. Her only reaction was to look directly at me as I descended the stairs. "You really did this, Nathan?" Her voice was soft, almost wounded. "To your own wife?" I didn't answer. I simply held her gaze, letting her see the full extent of my knowledge of her betrayal. As they led her to the police car, she turned back once. "If you hadn't always overshadowed me, I wouldn't have had to do this." Her final words hung in the air as the police car pulled away. I stood in the doorway watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it, expecting a message from the hospital about Caroline. Instead, "She didn't act alone. Don't be blinded by focusing on just one person." Below, the message was a photo. Me sitting at my desk at Baxley and Roth, taken through the glass partition of my office. Someone had been watching me, photographing me without my knowledge. The implication was clear. This wasn't over. 2 days after Jessica's arrest, I sat in a small observation room at the police station watching her through one-way glass. The woman on the other side barely resembled the perfectly polished wife I'd lived with for 5 years. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. No makeup concealed the pallor of her skin. For the first time since I'd known her, Jessica had completely lost control of her carefully maintained image. Inspector Ed Morrison entered the interrogation room. A veteran detective in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and weathered features, he specialized in slow poisoning cases. He placed a folder on the table between them and sat down without speaking, studying Jessica with practiced patience. "Let's start simple." Morrison finally said, his voice deceptively gentle. "Why don't you tell me about Sunday morning?" Jessica straightened her posture, attempting to reclaim some dignity. "This is all a misunderstanding. Nathan has become paranoid lately. Stress from work. I think Caroline has had health issues for years, pre-existing conditions." Morrison nodded as if considering this. "What health issues specifically?" "Low blood pressure. Anxiety attacks. She's always been fragile." Jessica's voice gained confidence as she spoke. "Interesting," Morrison replied, opening his folder. "Because her medical records show no history of either condition. In fact, her last physical described her as exceptionally healthy." Jessica's eyes flicked momentarily to the folder. "Those records must be incomplete." Morrison pulled out a DVD. "We have some footage I'd like you to see." He slid the disc into a player beneath the small TV mounted on the wall. The kitchen camera footage began playing crystal clear images of Jessica measuring drops from a vial into my coffee cup that morning. Jessica's face went blank. Then Morrison placed her journal of dosages and effects on the table. "Would you like to explain these notes in your handwriting? The careful documentation of increasing poison levels. The effectiveness ratings." Jessica remained silent, staring at the evidence. "Why did you increase the dosage each time, Mrs. Hale?" Morrison pressed. After a long pause, Jessica finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Because he never fell down. He just kept going like nothing happened." "You wanted him to fall so you could rise, is that it?" Jessica's eyes glistened, but she didn't answer. I couldn't watch passively any longer. I requested permission to speak with her directly. After consulting with the district attorney, Morrison agreed since I was the primary victim. The detective left the room as I entered. Only Jessica and I remained with cameras recording every word I took the seat across from her, placing my hands flat on the table between us. "Tell me why," I said, simply looking directly into her eyes. Jessica met my gaze. "Because I tried so hard, Nathan. But you always took everything. I have talent too. I have ambition. I'm not just your shadow. So you quietly poisoned your husband for 8 months. I kept my voice level despite the rage building inside me. At first, I just wanted you sick enough to miss a few meetings." She replied, a disturbing calm settling over her. "But you still went to work. You still got chosen for every project. You still got all the trust, all the praise. It drove me crazy. Did you ever love me?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Jessica gave a cold smile. To love someone is to love fairness. I was never given fairness. The clinical detachment in her voice chilled me more than any show of emotion could have. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated elimination of an obstacle. "What about Caroline?" I demanded. "You nearly killed your own sister." "I didn't want her to die." Jessica said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her tone. "I calculated your doses precisely just enough to put you in the hospital, not enough to kill." I slammed my palm on the table, finally letting anger show. "And what if she doesn't recover today? What then?" Jessica lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly for the first time. "Do you understand what you've done?" I continued. "Not just to me, but to someone who's loved you unconditionally since childhood, your own blood." She remained silent, shoulders hunched. The toxicology report came back. I said, pulling a paper from my pocket. "Pterodenticide, a controlled neurotoxin used in pharmaceutical research. Classified as lethal in doses above 0.8 milligrams. Your last entry shows you were planning to use 0.7. I stood up, unable to stay seated across from her any longer. "One more dose, Jessica. That's how close you were to crossing from attempted murder to the real thing." "You were never supposed to find out," she whispered. "It was all so carefully planned." "Except for one detail," I replied. "I survived. I noticed. I gathered evidence." I moved toward the door, having heard enough. Before I could reach it, Jessica's voice stopped me. "Nathan." I turned back. She had raised her head, tears streaming down her face for the first time. "You've won, Nathan," she said softly. "But maybe I'm not the only one who wanted to see you fall." The words struck me like a physical blow. Unbidden. My mind flashed to the mysterious photograph I'd received me sitting in my office, unaware I was being watched through the glass partition. Someone else had been monitoring me, documenting my movements. Someone who might have encouraged or even guided Jessica's actions. As I stepped back into the hallway, a cold certainty settled over me. This conspiracy ran deeper than just my wife's jealousy. 3 months after Jessica's arrest, the media frenzy showed no signs of abating. Headlines screamed across every platform. Ad executive's wife, poisons husband to climb corporate ladder. The story had morphed from local news into a national sensation, a cautionary tale of ambition gone toxic. Business magazines featured my portrait with headlines like, "The Man Who Survived His Wife's Poison." I declined most interview requests, but eventually agreed to one carefully vetted appearance on a respected news program that promised to focus on workplace dynamics rather than sensationalism. Even so, the segment was marketed as "Dark Corporate Marriages," when competition comes home. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on the first day of trial. I entered through a side door escorted by security. Inside the courtroom, I took my seat behind the prosecution table, maintaining the same composed exterior I'd relied on throughout my career. Control had become my armor. When they brought Jessica in, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the designer wardrobe and perfect makeup. She wore a modest navy suit, her hair pulled back severely. She didn't look at me, didn't speak to anyone, not even her attorney. This Jessica, cold, detached, emotionless, seemed more real than the wife I'd lived with for years. Mitchell Devane, my attorney who was working with the prosecution, methodically presented the evidence. His measured delivery made the facts all the more damning. The evidence will show, he told the jury, a calculated escalating campaign of poisoning spanning 8 months. The courtroom fell silent as the recording from the brunch played. Jessica's voice echoed through the speakers. I made it special just for you. Jurors shifted uncomfortably when they heard Caroline's labored breathing in the background, followed by my urgent call to 911. The home security footage came next. Crisp, unmistakable images of Jessica adding drops from a vial to my coffee. Several jurors visibly recoiled. Then the poison journal. An expert witness identified the substance as pterodenticide, a controlled neurotoxin used in pharmaceutical research that causes progressive neurological symptoms with repeated exposure. At the levels recorded in Mrs. Hale's notebook, the toxicologist testified, another 2 or 3 doses would likely have caused permanent organ damage or death. Caroline took the stand on the 3rd day, still showing lingering effects of the poisoning. Her hands trembled slightly as she was sworn in. I thought I had an autoimmune condition, she testified. I never imagined it was my own sister deliberately poisoning me. Her voice broke. The doctors say I may have permanent nerve damage in my hands. Jessica's defense team attempted to shift blame, painting her as a victim of psychological manipulation. My client suffered from workplace depression. Her attorney argued, in a high-pressure industry dominated by men married to an overbearing husband who constantly outshone her misses. Hale's judgment became impaired. I watched as Jessica dabbed at crocodile tears during this testimony. When her attorney suggested she never intended to cause permanent harm, I couldn't remain silent any longer. I requested to testify, an unusual move since I'd already provided depositions. The judge allowed it. As I took the stand, the courtroom hushed. I spoke directly to the jury, my voice level. I was poisoned repeatedly over 8 months. I survived. But the trust I placed in my wife died. I paused, meeting the eyes of several jurors. A talented woman can compete with skill, not poison. Jessica chose the latter because she couldn't accept being second place, even if that meant putting me in the ground. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours before returning with their verdict. I stood as the foreman spoke the words that would close this chapter of my life. On all counts of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and malicious poisoning, we find the defendant guilty. Jessica showed no reaction until the judge delivered his sentence, 25 years imprisonment, without possibility of parole, followed by 5 years of mandatory medical supervision after release. Only then did she break. Not quiet tears, but harsh, racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. I realized she wasn't crying for Caroline or for me. She was mourning her career, her social standing, her carefully constructed image, all permanently destroyed by her own hand. You have used your intelligence to calculate harm rather than create value, the judge said during his final remarks. The court cannot ignore the methodical nature of your actions, nor the fact that you were willing to poison your own sister when she became an inconvenient witness. As guards led Jessica away, she didn't look back at me. Her shoulders were slumped in defeat, a posture I'd never seen in the years we were married. Walking out of the courtroom felt like emerging from underwater sounds. Sharper colors, brighter air, sweeter. Reporters shouted questions I had no intention of answering. I focused instead on the exit, on the future beyond these doors. That's when I saw him. A man leaning against a marble column in the courthouse lobby. Dark suit, expensive watch, observing me with calculated interest. When our eyes met, he nodded slightly, then raised his hand in a subtle gesture, tracing the outline of my company's logo in the air. As he turned to leave, I caught sight of the emblem on his lapel pin, the distinctive red triangle of Colwick Agency, Baxley and Roth's biggest competitor. He smiled knowingly before disappearing into the crowd. A cold realization washed over me. This wasn't just about Jessica's professional jealousy. The curtain had fallen on this act, but the play wasn't over. Someone else had been pulling strings, and they were still in the theater watching from the wings. 1 year after Jessica's sentencing, I stood at the window of my new corner office watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled over the skyline. The brass nameplate on my door now read Nathan Hale, Executive Partner. A promotion that had come 3 months after the trial concluded I'd spent the year rebuilding, reclaiming, and rising, Baxley and Roth had given me control of 4 international campaigns, including the Henderson account, which I'd secured for another 3 years, despite aggressive poaching attempts from Colwick Agency. The victory was particularly sweet, knowing what I now knew about Jessica's correspondence with them. Next week, I would deliver the keynote address at the National Marketing Summit, a platform usually reserved for industry legends. My speech, titled "Success Isn't Luck, It's Survival," had already generated buzz in trade publications. On the surface, everything had turned around. The media portrayed me as the resilient executive who'd overcome personal tragedy to reach new professional heights. Industry colleagues treated me with a mix of admiration and cautious distance, unsure how to approach a man who'd survived what I had. But privately, some things had changed permanently. I still carefully sniffed every cup of coffee before drinking it. I installed additional security cameras in my new apartment, and I found myself unconsciously cataloging exits whenever I entered a room. Habits of a survivor that wouldn't fade. The letters began arriving from Nashville Women's Correctional Facility, 3 months after Jessica started serving her sentence. At first, I returned them unopened. Then I simply had them collected and filed unread. Emails went directly to a folder I never opened. Phone calls to my assistant were logged and ignored. "She wants to explain," my assistant told me after one such call. "Says there's more to the story." "There always is with Jessica." I replied, "That doesn't make it true." Caroline received similar entreaties. One evening over dinner at her house, our monthly ritual now, though with takeout instead of home-cooked meals, she told me about Jessica's most recent call. She begged me to help with an appeal for sentence reduction. Caroline said, gently swirling her wine glass. Her hands still trembled slightly, a permanent reminder of the poison's effects. I hung up. "Does she think we'll forgive her?" Caroline asked after a long silence. I looked at my sister-in-law. Technically, still my sister-in-law until the divorce was finalized next month. Forgiveness isn't something she's earned. She should be grateful. I haven't ensured she dies in prison. Caroline's eyes widened slightly. She knew I could have pressed for attempted murder of multiple victims, which might have doubled Jessica's sentence. Another choice I'd made mercy. Perhaps, though, it hadn't felt like it at the time. 6 months after the trial, an unmarked manila envelope arrived at my office. Inside was a printout of an email thread between Jessica and Marcus Donovan, Colwick Agency's executive creative director. The messages detailed a plan for Jessica to ensure Nathan's absence from key presentations, allowing her to take lead on the Henderson pitch, after which she would transfer to Colwick with a substantial sign-on bonus. Attached was my original Henderson pitch deck sent from Jessica's personal email with all proprietary strategy intact. I immediately contacted Mitchell Devane, who filed additional charges: corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets. These weren't just personal betrayals. They were federal crimes. The supplemental trial was brief. The evidence spoke for itself. Jessica had sold company secrets in exchange for a promised executive position with our chief competitor. The judge added 10 years to her sentence, along with a lifetime ban from working in the communications industry and substantial financial penalties. I watched via closed-circuit television as Jessica received this new sentence. She collapsed into gut-wrenching sobs. But I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not pain. Just a hollow recognition that justice had been fully served. One rainy evening shortly after I drove to the lake where we'd taken our wedding photos 5 years earlier, I brought a USB drive containing all the evidence recordings and documentation from both trials. Standing at the water's edge, I tossed it into the depths, watching ripples spread and disappear. She tried to destroy me with a cup of coffee. I said to the empty shoreline, but the only thing she truly destroyed was her own life. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Her clemency petition was denied. Full 35-year sentence confirmed. I texted back. For the first time in a long time, I might sleep without double-checking the locks. The following morning, I stood on the executive floor of Baxley and Roth, watching the sunrise over the city. I held a cup of espresso I'd brewed myself in the office kitchen, steam rising in the golden light. A young creative director approached, stopping beside me at the window. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked hesitantly. I took a careful sip of my coffee before answering. "No, but every time I drink coffee, I remember that if I'd been weak, she would have won. I turned away from the window, back toward the agency that had once been our shared battlefield and was now unquestionably my domain. In the subtle shift of morning light, my shadow stretched long across the polished floor, solid, undiminished, and entirely my own.